Real people, real opinions.
Real Talk Radio. The multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.
Ireland's classic hits.
Many of you might have watched the documentary that was on Virgin Media going back only a few weeks ago, actually, Confessions of a Crime Boss. And it was about the former crime boss, John Gilligan, where he discussed, his infamous stint in the Irish underworld, including, of course, his trial for the murder and crime journalist Veronica Guerin. And for those of you who don't remember, and most of you should, of course, Veronica Guerin was an investigative journalist focused on organised crime in the Republic of Ireland. And on the evening of the 25th of June 1996, Gilligan, drug gang members, Charles Bowden, Brian Meehan, Kieran Muscles Concannon, Peter Mitchell and Paul Ward met at their distribution premises in Greenmount Industrial Estate. Bowden, the gang's distributor and ammunition quartermaster, supplied them with the three of them with a Colt Python revolver loaded with 357 Magnum semi wad cutter bullets. On the 26th of June 1996, while driving her red Opel Calibra, Veronica Guerin stopped at the red light at the Nace Dual carriageway near Newlands Cross on the outskirts of Dublin, unaware that she was even being followed. Now, she was shot fatally by one of the two men sitting on a motorcycle. About an hour after Guerin was murdered, a meeting took place in Moore Street between Bowden, Meehan, Mitchell. Bowden later denied under oath in court that the purpose of the meeting was the disposal of the weapon, but rather that it was an excuse to appear in a public setting, place for them to be away from the incident. At the time of the murder, of course, John Traynor was seeking a High Court order against Veronica Guerin to prevent her from publishing a book about his involvement in organised crime. And Veronica Guerin was killed 2 days before she was due to speak at a Freedom Forum conference in London. And the topic of her segment was dying to tell the story. Journalists at risk, ironically enough. Well, a man who did those interviews, if you watch that documentary on Virgin Media, it was based on the interviews carried out by Jason O'Toole. And Jason O'Toole is one of Irish best authors, interviewers, and also a newspaper columnist as well in his time. His book is called The Gilligan Tapes. Ireland's most notorious crime boss, in his own words, by Jason O'Toole, and he joins me on the line. Jason, good evening to you.
Hi, Niall. Thanks for having me on the show. Nice to talk to you again.
And Jason, you have got so many compliments in relation to this book and I know you for a long time, Jason. We've spoken many, many times, and you have this way of interviewing people, which I admire greatly, which gets the best out of people. In other words, slowly bringing them in and befriending them to some degree, I suppose, to get that all that information out of them. Firstly, I suppose the most important thing is, why John Gilligan in particular? Did you have a huge interest in the underworld and what had happened to Veronica Guerin?
Well, it wasn't so much to do with Veronica, but definitely I had a fascination with the underworld going back to the late 90s. And do you remember the film The General came out, the John Borman film?
Yes, yeah. Great movie.
Yeah, and after I watched that movie, I realised, walked out of the cinema, Savoy Cinema, and I said to myself, you don't actually see interviews with these characters. You read a lot about them in the papers, but you never see in-depth interviews with them themselves. There was a couple in Hot Press, one with Martin Cattle, and I think McGill had one with Martin Cattle too. And apart from that, I hadn't really seen any other articles. So I decided when I joined Hot Press, I wanted to go out and do these type of interviews. Dutchy Holland, Fat Puss, Gilligan, Christy Bronco Dunn, all these type of characters, And how it came about was originally I interviewed Gilligan for Hot Press in 2008 when he was in Portlaoise Prison. And how I got that interview was I flew over to Rome to meet the guy that was representing him, Giovanni Di Stefano. You might remember him.
Yes, I do remember the name, yeah.
He represented a rogues gallery of people like Harold Shipman and Chemical Ali and Saddam Hussein and Dutchy Holland and Gilligan. And it turned out he was actually not a qualified solicitor, and he ended up doing 10 years in London in English prison for fraud. And Jim Stearns makes a documentary about him at the moment. But anyway, to cut a long story short, I went over and interviewed him for Hot Press, and he liked the interview. And when I was leaving him in Rome at the time, I said, any chance of an interview with your client, Gilligan? And he said, leave it with me. And I never thought I'd hear from him again. And then about 2 or 3 months later, he phoned me from Baghdad and said, that interview is being set up. You're on the guest list, so to speak. You can go into Portlaoise Prison and interview Gilligan. And I did that interview. We ran it across 13
And what's the legalities of that? Because I know there have been instances throughout time, where somebody's committed maybe a serious crime, where a judge would say that you're not allowed to do any interviews, you're not allowed to profit from this, you're not allowed, So is there any restrictions around interviewing, what they consider to be a serious criminal?
Well, at that stage, that interview caused a lot of controversy, and the then Minister for Justice, Dermot Ahern, demanded an investigation into how I got the interview. I'd signed myself in as a guest to do it, and subsequently Hot Press magazine was banned from the prison system over it.
Okay.
It was ridiculous.
All right, okay. Because I suppose some people would suggest, and I'm not suggesting it obviously because I work in media, but some people would suggest that you're glamorising crime. What do you say to those people who say that?
Oh, no, definitely not glamorising crime. I mean, I believe that future historians and criminologists will use it, the book, The Gilligan Tape, as a primary source when they're writing about crime in Ireland in the latter stages of the 20th century, because we're hearing it from the horse's mouth. We're hearing how criminals think, how they speak, their overall attitudes to criminality. So in that sense, I think it's a very valuable exercise. And my hope is also that if younger readers or viewers from working class or deprived backgrounds who might be vulnerable to getting involved in crime, that the book would actually steer them away from a life of crime, because even Gilligan said it himself repeatedly in the book, crime does not pay. And in the last page of the book, he says he was urging young readers not to get involved in criminality, that he felt he wasted his life. And
well, he didn't feel like that at the time. But getting back to, so when you met him this time around, where did you meet him for these particular recordings that obviously all this was based on, both the book and the documentary? Where did you meet him?
In a place called Torrevieja, outside of Alicante, in Spain, seaside resort town. How it came about was I met Gilligan after he got out of prison in 2013. And we talked initially then about the idea of me doing a book on him, but he wouldn't admit to being a drug dealer or his drug operation, because at the time he had an ongoing case with CAB and he wasn't going to admit to that. So I kind of thought to myself,
that would be a waste of time. Yeah,
it'd be like interviewing Neil Armstrong and not asking him about the moon.
I'm not talking about the moon. Absolutely, of course. And by the way, of course, we have to remember, for those that don't know, he served the longest sentence in Irish history for drugs. Because the underlying problem that was around this whole case, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But so when you sat down to meet him, I mean, firstly, what sort of person is he? I mean, most of us would have a fear of a man like Gilligan, particularly if we've seen the movie, by the way, because he comes across in the movie, and played very well, by the way, in the movie, but he comes across as being, aggressive, arrogant, and some sort of narcissist. So what sort of individual was he?
Yeah. I mean, the film is the guy who played him in the film is a brilliant actor, but Gilligan didn't come across that way to me. That's kind of I suppose a cartoon version of him, a caricature really. Look, he's an intelligent guy, and he's a charming guy. He's resourceful, but with John, everything is really about the bottom line. He's not some sort of working class Robin Hood hero. He's not a helpless victim of fate or society. The book is not a sob story. He'd plenty of opportunities to walk away from a life of crime, and he admits that. By his own confession, he chose to be a criminal. He chose to act in this manner. But, he did his best to put me at ease, because he knew I was a bit apprehensive, to say the least, about meeting him.
Well, you would be, yeah.
Yeah. But he did he did do his best to put me at ease. I remember when he came into, I had booked a room for a week to do the interviews, and when he came into the room, he started joking about how he wished he still had it in him to steal the cameras.
Right, okay. But let's go back to his early days. I just kind of glancing through the book. You sent me the book, by the way. It's an amazing book. But and there's a lot of it, by the way, because for most of us, what we know about John Gilligan and Veronica Guerin, of course, sadly, is what we've seen in the movie, because a lot of us would have seen the movie. And so we look at parts of the movie, and then there are parts of the movie which are in the book, so to speak, but in real life, if you know what I mean, and his version of what actually happened. For example, he talks about the time where she came up to the door, knocking on the door, and he was accused of assault when he tore her blouse and all that. And he, of course, disputes, the version that's in the movie, and says it wasn't like that at all. Now, that's entirely up to who you happen to believe. Unfortunately, Veronica's not with us anymore, so can't give her version. But going back to his youth, he had a gambling addiction at a very young age. Do you think that's what started or kicked off this life of criminality, to pay for the gambling addiction? Because he was one of the first people probably with a mobile phone, and his friends would say he was constantly on the phone, putting on bets.
Yeah, I mean, and he tells me in the book that he reckons he gambled at least 20 million punts during his life and lost it. A phenomenal amount of money. But it goes back earlier than just the gambling with him. But the gambling is a big part of it, definitely, and he admits that. You see, about Gilligan, you mentioned there about the Veronica Guerin thing, and the previous books that have been written about him or about her, they haven't really been able to go in depth into his life before he became an infamous criminal. There's not much backstory known about him. So in the book, he's given a lot of length to talk about and his life before he became a criminal and his life of crime in the early days. And I think that's really one of the most fascinating parts of the book. But he said that his first crime was when he was 9 years old, because he was selling firewood door to door in Ballyfermot and Palmerstown, because his father was never putting food on the table. He was a small-time criminal. He was off drunk all the time or off gambling himself, and there was no money in the house. And they had a huge family. So he said at 9 years old he was going off and he was pushing a pram around selling firewood door to door. But one day a woman said to him, "Then I'll buy 4 or 5 bundles off you. Here's a fiver. Do you have change?" And he said, "My dad will have change. He's at the corner. I'll go get it." And he said he left the pram at the door and he ran. And he said he never looked back. That was his first crime, and he just kept going. So then, when he was 14 or 15, he dropped out of school and he joined. He had a life. He went to a life of sea. Then at that stage, he worked at the B&I first, and then he became a merchant seaman. And he said what would happen is he'd dock at Liverpool, and with his wage for the month, go in and gamble and lose it all in an hour. And he'd have to go back on a ship for a month or 6 weeks to make up money again. And he said the second time this happened, again, he'd lost all his money and he was sleeping on a park bench one night. And the cops woke him up and said, "You can't sleep here." And he went down the road for a ramble, and he hooked up with this gang that were breaking into a jeweller's shop, and started breaking into different shops with them. And that's how he really started to get into criminality from that point. And then he said he went home and somebody said to him, he was robbed, ducking and diving at that stage. And someone said, "Do you fancy robbing the bank?" And he said, "How much will I get?" And they said, 5 or 6 grand. And he said, "Okay, count me in." So that's how he got into bank robberies.
His biggest robbery, according to himself, was unusually Ferguson VHS recorders. Seemingly, according to the book anyway, he made £1 million out of selling these stolen Ferguson VHS recorders.
Yeah, that was a famous story back in the 80s. And it's kind of a funny story in some ways. It shows his sense of humour. He robbed all these VHS machines worth £1 million, and he went in and bought one, and they were roughly around £1,000 each to buy at the time. Yeah. And he went in and bought one and put the receipt underneath it. So when the cops raided his house, they'd see the machine, and then they turn it upside down and see the receipt, so he could have a laugh at them.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so he was doing that type of carry on.
When did he get married, by the way? When did he marry Geraldine?
Oh, when she fell, they first met when she was 14, but he thought she was 16 years old. And then I think when she was about 19, they got married, and then 5 or 6 months later, their first child was born. And then,
he does say in the book that he kept her kind of in the dark in relation to the life of crime. Now, he said she was aware of the cigarettes and all that kind of stuff, right? But that he kind of kept her in the dark pretty much in relation to the crimes that he was involved in. Do you believe that?
Well, he is a very secretive character. For example, when I conducted all these interviews with him in Torrevieja, it took me nearly a year to do it, and I did over 40 hours of interviews on videotape and another 20 to 30 hours on audio tape. He never told anyone. His partner, Sharon, didn't even know there was a documentary and a book coming down the tracks. And he asked me, "Listen, tell me a day before it's going to be announced so I can tell my family." And I told him that. And then he rang them up all that night and said, "This is going to be announced tomorrow." So he is a very secretive character. He doesn't tell anybody anything unless he always says a need-to-know basis.
I mean, in a couple of occasions you tried to go straight. You talk about in the book at one stage in 1978, he decided to go straight. How long did that last?
Well, I think he lasted about a year that time. He tried a few different times, but that was the time I think he bought the garage, or that was in the early 80s, where he claimed he got harassed by the guards, and he decided to get back into a life of crime.
Yeah.
So, but he admits, as I said, like he does admit it's not a sob story. He did have plenty of opportunities to walk away from it, but he talks at great length about getting a great buzz out of stealing. But he said ultimately he did it for the money, where Martin Cattle the general would steal just for a buzz, he said. But for him, he got a high out of it, in the sense that he loved knowing that all the factories were there, and in his mind, he owned everything in these factories.
Did you ask him at all? Did he ever think of the victims of his crimes?
Oh yeah, that's in the book.
Yeah.
And I said to him, I pointed out to him, about insurance and different things like that would go up because of his criminality.
People lose their jobs, etc.
Yeah. I pointed all that out to him. The questions are pretty hard in the book, and he just said, like, as far as he was concerned, he would offer to sell the stolen goods back to the guys, whoever he stole it from, a major discount, and if they didn't want it, sure, they'd get the insurance. And that was his attitude. He didn't think further than that.
Do you think the criminal mind, like his, operates differently to a standard person's mind? Like when you were talking to him, did you get that impression that he didn't get social cues, or he lacked empathy, or did he have empathy?
Oh no, he comes across as he has empathy, definitely, but you can see the eyes going over time. He just thinks in a different direction than you and I would think. He's probably got he's thinking about 10 different things at the same time, I always feel.
And at any stage, would he have been conscious, do you think, when he was talking to you over God knows how many hours you sat talking to him, and there's hours and hours, of course, of recordings that are all documented in the book, by the way. But did he, at any stage, did you get the impression he was holding back because of maybe legal reasons? I better not admit to that, or I better not admit to this, or I better not mention that person in case they shaft me, or did you get the impression he was holding back at any stage?
Initially, in the early days, and he said, I can't incriminate myself here, but I can talk about every case I was charged for. But then the more I started to talk to him, the more he started to open up, and he started to reveal things that he didn't have to reveal. I mean, he got very honest at one stage. He talks about assaulting his ex-wife, Geraldine, when I asked him, did he ever hit her? And he said, yes. I think the majority of people just that wife beaters, or whatever you want to call them, would deny that. They wouldn't admit that. And then he started to admit to other things, like Dutchie Holland was a hitman, he told me. So he got very frank. I'm sure there's things he didn't want to talk about, but I did ask him questions in the book, like, for example, the time he was shot 6 times and left for dead. Did he receive any compensation from the people that put the hit out on him? And he said, I'm not going into that. I'm not talking about that. So those answers.
So there were moments where he pulled back a bit, yeah.
Yeah. So and that's all covered, very well in the book.
Now, I want to get to, obviously, Veronica Guerin, because, of course, that would be the one thing that everybody would know John Gilligan for. And, of course, you know as well as I do now at this stage, the family, Veronica Guerin's family, have criticised the documentary, and they said it was insensitive. And obviously they will criticise your work and say that it's insensitive. How do you feel about that? Were you conscious of that? Both writing the book and playing a part, obviously, in the documentary as well, because the book played a part in it. Were you conscious of that?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's in an early chapter in the book, Gilligan, the first chapter on Flanagan in the book, Gilligan said something about her that, and I have in my notes in the book that I didn't even bother transcribing his answer because I just felt it was too insensitive. So I was, I have huge sympathy for the family. Look, the producer on the documentary, his name is David Harvey.
I know David well. Yeah.
He's on the board of RTE. But since the age of 19, he was a very close friend of Veronica's, and in fact, during the first meeting I had with him, he showed me a picture of himself with Veronica. So he would never set out to desecrate the memory of someone, he
I know.
respected and valued as a friend.
For those who don't remember, Dave Harvey was actually on. He used to be on RT television on Crime Line, so he was very much involved and against crime. And Dave, by the way, used to be a presenter at this radio station at one stage, go back about 10 years ago. So he actually did the daytime show that I then went on to do. So yeah, I know David very well. He's a really nice guy, and he would be very conscious of that. I would be aware that he'd be a very, very professional man in the way he deals with things. So, but of course, you did hear the criticisms of the family, and it was all over the papers that the family weren't too pleased with the documentary after the first one was screened. It went over three weeks. Obviously, the first one, they weren't very happy about it.
Yeah, and they didn't criticise. Nobody seems to have criticised the book.
No.
Which I think speaks volumes about that. But look, David, like me, we wanted to get Gilligan to finally speak on the record about his life of crime and dissect what he had to say for himself, And he does make some startling revelations in the book. Stuff that, he talks about tampering with evidence in a courtroom, stealing evidence and things like that. So I think from that perspective, it's really a worthy project. You're giving the guy enough rope to let him do the job himself type of thing. But the one thing that really kind of struck me as silly was before the first episode aired and even before the book had hit the shops, three government ministers, including the Minister for Drugs and the Minister for Justice, before they'd even seen the episode, they were criticising it, and I felt like I was trapped in an episode of Father Ted with down with this sort of thing mantra, and I wondered did they believe in free speech, we didn't glorify crime in the book, we didn't do it in the documentary.
No, I've read the book, and it doesn't glorify crime because it's quite clear that John Gilligan knew what he was doing was wrong. And it was quite clear with the questions that you asked him, by the way, some of the questions are intriguing, but it's quite clear from the questions that you asked him that you condemned everything that he did throughout his life of crime, and that it was a warning to young people not to get involved in crime. But let's just go back, if we can, to he obviously talked to you in detail about what happened on that fateful day, and obviously the day before as well. Now, he seemed to be pinning everything on Bowden. Do you believe him?
I do on that. My hunch always had been that Bowden was the hitman from when I first interviewed Gilligan in 2008 and then in 2013, because I put that question to him then at the time, and he shut up. He wouldn't talk about it at the time. And look, Bowden was in the army, and he had become, I think, he had won a lot of prizes for his marksmanship in the army, shooting competitions. And I asked Gilligan, why did Bowden confessed to loading the gun to the guards, and I asked Gilligan, why would he even do that? And Gilligan said because he was actually afraid they had found the gun and they would have seen his fingerprints on it. So that's why he came up with that story. So and also Brian Meehan, one of the reasons Brian Meehan didn't do the shooting, wasn't the hitman, was because he had previously attempted to kill someone twice and missed twice. I mean, shot him at close range, the guy lived, and then missed him the second time. So they said that, there's no way he was going to be the hitman, so they had to get somebody else to do it. And everybody has always thought it was Dutchy Holland, and I interviewed Dutchy Holland myself. But an eyewitness at the scene actually had described a younger person as being the passenger on the bike. And Dutchy has.
Well, it would be hard to tell. They were wearing helmets, so I suppose it would have been reasonably hard to tell.
Yeah, but you would have seen the broken nose, I think, on Dutchy.
Yeah,
that would have stood out because he had a very prominent.
He did,
broken nose. But Gilligan.
But did Gilligan?
Dutchy was a hitman.
When you were talking to Gilligan, his involvement in this, of course, he denied all involvement in it at the time. But his involvement in this, did he admit his involvement in it?
No, Gilligan is adamant that this was done behind his back, that he had no control over it all, and he blames Traynor on it all because, as you pointed out in the introduction to this interview, Traynor had an injunction against Veronica Guerin at the time.
Yeah, for a book she was bringing out. Yeah,
an article actually in the Sunday Independent. I think maybe she was going to do a book too, but she had told Traynor she was going to print in the Sunday Independent that he was a heroin dealer, which mortified him. And Gilligan says in the book that Traynor's kids played with their neighbours' kids who happened to be the guards, either both the parents or one of the parents, and he was mortified that this was going to destroy his life. So,
but when you say that he wouldn't admit his involvement, The world and his mother knows that he was involved in it. And, and the courts knew he was involved in it. That's why he got such a long sentence for drugs. I mean, everybody knows that he was obviously, the leader of that gang, so to speak, or he was the head honcho. Yeah. So, I mean, to suggest that he wasn't involved seems bizarre, doesn't it?
Well, he claims that they all went rogue on him, and this was done behind his back. So that's his version of events, It really is for others to judge his actions. I'm not a prosecution barrister or a defence barrister. I'm not a judge. I merely gather the facts or the quotes and put the interviews together. And hopefully give the subject enough rope to hang themselves. I think that the deeds describe the man. He doesn't. I think the Irish Times even said he didn't come out of well, the documentary. But my motives were out of curiosity. Gilligan himself, his motives were for doing the documentary and the book was, he's 71 years of age. By his own admission, he probably doesn't have many years left, And
what did he say about Veronica, by the way? I'm sure you asked him about the relationship he had with Veronica Guerin, because she was an investigative journalist who made his life difficult. There's no doubt about that. She made his life difficult. And that's her job. And by the way, he deserves to have his life made difficult because he's a criminal. So what did he say about his relationship with her and the way that relationship was portrayed, particularly in the movie, which we'd be all familiar with? Was the movie accurate in the way they portrayed that relationship?
Well, everything Gilligan told me is 180 degrees opposite of what we've been told. His version of events is that she was doorstepping him that day because she was writing a movie and she wanted to get information out of him about criminality. So that's his version, where everybody's, the long-standing version of events has been that she doorstepped him, to find out how the hell he could afford all this, the equestrian centre and everything, when he's apparently meant to be on the dole. So even when I said, what was your reaction when she was shot? He said he didn't care. That's how blunt he was. He said it'd be no different from hearing if a US president had been shot.
But he did care. And we all know he cared, because what happened was, of course, when she was shot, and the only positive thing to come out of that, because it was such a sad loss to society, was that it put the limelight on Gilligan and his gang and every other person in the underworld. So in other words, the focus was suddenly on them. Cab were suddenly came along and start taking all their possessions off them. So it had a huge impact on them. And he knew that was going to happen. He must have known. He wasn't stupid.
Yeah, and he always a cab is one of the things that'll annoy him, because he'd repeatedly say, and he repeatedly says in the book, cab was not set up over it because of him. That.
Well, it was set up over his gang. It was his gang.
Yeah, 96 cab came in. I do know that in 96.
I find it unbelievable, Jason, that he won't take any responsibility, considering the gang were his. He can say they've gone rogue all he wants, but they were his gang. You know what I mean?
He doesn't take any responsibility. There's no other way for me to put it. It just that's his reaction, and it's really down to, that's his comment, and it's really down to the reader to make up their own mind.
Of course,
what they want to believe,
Well, look, I have to say, Jason, it's a brilliant book, an absolutely amazing book. I think it's intriguing. I think for anybody who has an interest, I suppose, in the criminal underworld, it's an intriguing book. I think it's a good lesson for any young person who might read it, to show that a life of crime certainly doesn't pay. And it never will. I mean, John Gilligan is constantly, only recently he was back in court again in Spain, wasn't he? And mind you, he got away lightly this time as well. Very likely.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would have liked to see him go to jail again.
Yeah, he got a suspended sentence for having the possession of a handgun and drugs. I was really.
Do you think he'd ever stop? Is he ever going to stop?
I think that really frightened him recently, because I had put it to him. I said, when you're a younger guy, doing 4 or 5 years in prison is probably no big deal for you, but when you're in your 70s, I said to him, 1 year is akin to 7 years of a dog's life, So I think that rattled him a bit. And
does he still have money? He still has plenty of money, doesn't he?
Look, I don't believe he has much money. He was actually the day he got out of prison, he had a grey suit on, and the day I met him to start doing the interviews last year, he was wearing the same suit. with the buttons broken on it. I couldn't see any money there. You know, he is addicted to gambling, and he still gambles a lot. But it's cheaper over there in Torrevieja to have a decent enough lifestyle. I mean, you get a villa over there for half the price of a box room in Dublin at this stage. You know.
Yeah, it's about
You probably pay $550 a month or $600 a month. You get a villa over there with a swimming pool in Torrevieja.
Well, I'm sure he'll spend his last day. He'll spend his last days there. His last years of his life there. Probably he won't be back. You know.
Well, he says to me that he's going to leave Spain. That's what he's telling me now, because he's on a suspended sentence, and he's afraid that if there's any kind of slip up, or if he's kind of paranoid, thinking that somebody might try to frame him for something, and he'll end up, just doing time behind bars. Then
does he have enemies?
He says he doesn't. He's walking around freely in Torrevieja. I've followed him around the town to see what type of, his day-to-day activity would be like. He showed me where he socialized. He showed me the casinos and the bookies he likes to go to. And, he walks around freely over there. He doesn't get recognized that much either. It's a town full of, Germans and Russians and Ukrainian tourists, not tourists, refugees and English tourists. And there is a lot of Irish, but he seems to stay away from the Irish bars,
Yeah, but before we finish up too, I do want to obviously remember the sad loss of Veronica Guerin, and everybody, of course, when we talk about John Gilligan, will associate the two certainly together, because if John Gilligan didn't exist, as far as I'm concerned, and his gang didn't exist, Veronica Guerin would be still with us today. And, of course, most journalists around the country. I mean, and I suppose, too, you, Jason, when you're involved in that kind of investigation, at those kind of interviews, do you ever worry about that aspect of it?
Not these days. Probably I did in the past when, about 15 years ago, I interviewed over a dozen criminals, in-depth interviews for Hot Press, and there was a few dodgy moments. But the one thing I'll say is, I mean, there's a few chapters on the book about Veronica, and writing those chapters up, did upset me, thinking about how a journalist died trying to just do her job. But the book is not really about her. It's
about his life.
Gilligan and his life and his crimes,
Yeah, of course, but that is part of it as well, obviously, because
of course.
It's a major part of it. But look, again, the book is called The Gilligan Tapes, Ireland's Most Notorious Crime Boss, in his own words, by Jason O'Toole. Jason, listen, thank you very much indeed for coming on and talking to us. I appreciate it. It's not an easy subject to talk about, and I appreciate that. And it certainly wasn't an easy interview to do, I imagine, as well. But I mean, how many hours, by the way, of those tapes did you have?
40 hours on video and more than 20 hours on audio, so over 60 hours in total.
And when is that all going to be released? Will it?
Well, the book is out now, and the documentary has already been on. There's a possibility I might do something else with the material in the future, perhaps another book or perhaps a podcast, or you never know, even another documentary. But I'm sure something else will happen in the future. But at the moment, I'm just trying to plug the book as much as possible.
Okay. Well, listen, I appreciate that. Listen, thank you very much, Jason O'Toole. There you go. There's Jason O'Toole, the author, and the book is called The Gilligan Tapes. It is I've read the book. Well, most of it, actually. I haven't got quite to the end of it. But it is an interesting book. It is interesting to see how somebody could get themselves involved in a life of crime and how that can happen. The one part, obviously, and even Jason talks about the fact that he doesn't take any personal responsibility. He doesn't seem to want to take personal responsibility, but then that's the mind of a criminal, isn't it? And I'd certainly appreciate the family when they say they believe that, for the documentary or the book or everything, well, they didn't mention the book, but certainly the documentary can be deemed as insensitive. I suppose that depends on who you are. Obviously, if you're related to Veronica Guerin, I could completely understand that. And our memories do stick with Veronica Guerin and the loss of a wonderful journalist, an amazing journalist, because of John Gilligan's gang. We will never know the truth. I don't believe we'll ever know exactly what happened on that day, that fateful day, on the 25th of June, 1996. Or should I say 26th of June, 1996. But certainly we do know that it was John Gilligan's gang, although he will stick with his word and say that he personally wasn't responsible, that the gang went rogue. Hasn't that always been the story? And that's why at the time when he was got on a drugs charge, he got one of the highest sentences in the history of the state for a drugs charge because they couldn't get him on anything else. Anyway, Thank you very much to Jason for coming on and talking about the book. It's called The Gilligan Tapes, Ireland's most notorious crime boss. And you will find it in all the usual places, Amazon, all the usual bookshops, etc., etc.
Real people, real opinions.
Real Talk Radio, the multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.